As the 1930s progressed, the Swedish Navy was becoming more and more aware of how far it was being left behind. Although its days as an expeditionary force were long over, they still had a charge to protect their country, and the current destroyer fleet consisted almost entirely of what could be charitably described as torpedo boats with ambitions. Their displacement ranged from 350 to just over 400 tons, and the ships were of pre-World War I or World War I vintage, with the exception being 4 ships that were loosely grouped into the Ehrenskald class, which at least dated from the 1920s and displaced around 1,000 tons. But it was clear that the vast majority of these ships was soon to head for the breakers' yard, age, if nothing else, having caught up with them, and so a newer, more modern class of ships was needed. And so in 1933 the government voted through funds for 2 more destroyers, which were supposed to be somewhat similar to the previous vessels. However, the Swedish designers decided to make a few design changes and adopt the latest technology to come up with a much improved ship design. Although only about 6 foot longer and 4 inches wider than their predecessors, the new ships, initially dubbed the town or city type, as they were all to be named after Swedish coastal towns or cities, used partial welding to reduce the overall weight of the hull, and new light alloys to allow the superstructure in particular to be made much lighter than previously. Part of these weight savings were then used to make the bridge and the associated superstructure considerably larger by volume, which gave the ships an imposing appearance from the front and much more dry internal volume, a rather important feature for small craft which could expect to spend their lives largely in the Baltic Sea, with the attendant freezing conditions and months of darkness that this often entailed. The French manufacturers Penhuet and de Laval were called upon to provide powerful and compact machinery, something which at this stage of proceedings was a French speciality. This gave a twin-screw ship, which, although only displacing 1,060 tons standard, was provided with no less than 32,000 shaft horsepower. For reference, contemporary destroyers being built in other navies typically displaced 30 to 40% more, but only carried 10 to 25% more power. The high power-to-weight ratio thus allowed the ships to reach extremely high speeds, with them being clocked on trials at around 39 knots. Even the notoriously fast French contre-torpilleurs would not have a class under construction that was capable of matching these speeds for a few years hence. Firepower consisted of 3 dual-purpose 120mm or 4.7-inch Bofors guns, 1 mounted fore, 1 aft, and 1 amidships placed between 2 funnels. Anti-aircraft firepower was provided by 25mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns. This consisted of a twin-mount amidships after the bridge and a pair of single guns mounted on the wings. Additional firepower came courtesy of a pair of centerline mounted triple torpedo launchers and a pair of depth charge throwers, plus the capacity to carry a lot of mines, which was standard for anything that floated in the Swedish Navy bar the ship's boats, and then only because no one had managed to figure out an effective mine that was small enough to be mounted on said boats. The 2 ships authorised were named the Gothenburg or Goteborg and Stockholm. Both were laid down in 1934, but as the decade rolled on, 4 more ships were ordered in 2 pairs. The Malmö and Karlskrona were laid down in 1937, and the Norrköping and Gävle, I think, were laid down in 1939. As you might guess, small improvements were made, with the most obvious being the wing-mounted single 25mm guns being replaced with twin mounts, which brought the total up to 6 guns on the last 4 ships of the class. The first 3 ships were in service by the time World War II started, with the last 3 all in service by mid-1941, and as a result all 6 ships would have a role in maintaining Swedish neutrality during the war. But the lead ship was at the centre of the worst Swedish naval disaster of the 20th century when, in September 1941, while docked at Hårsfjärden, her torpedoes mysteriously detonated. The flames from ruptured oil tanks then took out 2 other nearby destroyers, but since she sank in harbour, she was refloated, repaired, and recommissioned a couple of years later. Post-war, the ships were the oldest destroyers to be considered for conversion. During the war, they'd picked up some additional anti-aircraft guns and depth charge equipment, But their fates would now diverge. Gothenburg was considered to be damaged and worn out, and so remained pretty much as she was in the late 1940s until she was taken out of service in 1958 and then sunk as a target in 1962. Stockholm and Norrköping had their centre main gun moved to a super-firing position aft. The 25mm anti-aircraft guns were replaced by 4 single 40mm Bofors, and they remained in this format until the mid-1960s when they were taken out of service, with Norrköping then serving as a gunnery target in the late 1970s. Malmö, Karlskrona and Gävle were converted into anti-submarine vessels. They also had their 25mm guns replaced by 40mm Bofors, but they lost the amidships 120mm gun completely and the torpedo tubes in exchange for a pair of Squid anti-submarine mortars and a tripling of their mine-carrying capacity. They would then serve until they were decommissioned in the late 1960s, with Malmö scrapped in 1969, Karlskrona used as a target ship, which she survived, and then was then scrapped in 1974, and Gävle was sold off as a floating steam power plant to provide the initial power during the commissioning of a Swedish nuclear reactor, before she was also scrapped in 1972.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.